Juan Vallejo Corona. In late May of 1971, a peach farmer named Goro Kagehiro was walking through the rows of his orchard along the Feather River in Sutter County, California, when he noticed something that didn't belong. Between two of his trees, a fresh hole had been dug the night before, and then filled back in. It was roughly the size and shape of a shallow grave. When sheriff's deputies arrived and began digging, they didn't find one body. They found the first of 25, buried in orchards up and down the river in graves that had gone unnoticed for months. And when investigators finally traced the paper trail back to a labor contractor named Juan Vallejo Corona, they would realize they were looking at what was, at the time, the worst mass murder case in American history. Corona had been born on February 7, 1934, in the state of Jalisco, Mexico. He had followed his older brothers north to California around 1950 to pick crops. And over the next 2 decades, he had worked his way up from field hand to labor contractor, running crews of migrant workers through the orchards of the Sacramento Valley. By the early 1970s, he was a familiar figure in the fields around Yuba City, married with 4 daughters, moving between farms and workers as harvest seasons came and went. That was the life he had built by the time the first body came out of the ground. The victims pulled from the orchards were transient farm workers, most of them men who had drifted through the labor circuit and left few people to notice they were missing. The manner of death was consistent from grave to grave. Most had been stabbed and hacked. Some had been mutilated. One had been shot in the head. And in the graves themselves, or near them, investigators recovered items that would decide the case before Corona ever set foot in a courtroom. There were receipts made out in his name, and a ledger book containing what appeared to be a list of the victims themselves. The excavations continued through the summer of 1971. Investigators worked outward from the first grave, opening one plot after another as tips came in from farmhands and as freshly disturbed soil was identified from the air. By the time the digging was finished, 25 bodies had been recovered from orchards on more than one property along the river. Some had been in the ground for months. A few, when unearthed, could no longer be visually identified and had to be matched to missing persons reports through dental records or through the personal effects found alongside the remains. The scale of the operation was unprecedented in California at the time, and the story moved almost immediately from local reporting to the national wire services. Corona was arrested and charged with 25 counts of first-degree murder. The trial was moved to Colusa County because of the publicity, and in January of 1973, a jury convicted him on every count. He was given 25 concurrent life sentences and formally received into the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation on February 17, 1973. That same year, at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville, Corona was attacked and stabbed by other inmates. He survived, but he lost the sight in his left eye. How does a man convicted of 25 murders get a second chance in court? In 1978, a state appellate court threw out Corona's conviction, ruling that his original attorney had failed to mount an adequate defense. Prosecutors immediately began preparing to try him again, and the second trial dragged on for months. In 1982, another jury reached the same verdict as the first. Corona was reconvicted on all 25 counts of first-degree murder, and the concurrent life sentences were reinstated. Whatever hope his defense had held out that a new jury might see the evidence differently had ended. Over the decades that followed, Corona would appear before the California Parole Board 8 separate times, and 8 separate times he would be denied. For most of those years, he insisted he was innocent. At his hearing in 2011, more than 40 years after the bodies were pulled from the orchards, his position shifted for the first time. He admitted responsibility for the killings, but described the victims as trespassers who had been on land where they did not belong. It was not the confession the board had been waiting for. His final denial came in 2016. By that point, Corona had been transferred to the California State Prison at Corcoran, where he had been housed in the facility's protective housing unit since 1992. The unit was reserved for a small population of inmates whose notoriety made general population housing impossible. Corona lived out the rest of his life there. He was diagnosed with dementia in his later years and eventually stopped attending hearings altogether. He died on March 4, 2019, of natural causes at an outside hospital while still an inmate of the state. He was 85 years old. Corona died before he ever provided a full account of what had happened in those orchards, and the case now stands entirely on the physical evidence gathered in 1971 and the two juries that heard it. Corona spent nearly half a century inside the California prison system for a crime rooted in the fields of the Sacramento Valley. The next name on this list would spend almost as long inside those same walls, but the crime that put him there did not happen in an orchard or a farmhouse. It happened in a hotel ballroom in Los Angeles, in front of a room full of witnesses, in what should have been one of the most triumphant nights of American political history. Sirhan Bishara Sirhan. Just after midnight on June 5, 1968, Senator Robert F. Kennedy walked off the stage of the Embassy Ballroom at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, having just won the California Democratic presidential primary. He took a shortcut through the hotel pantry to reach a press conference, shaking hands with kitchen staff along the way. A young man stepped out from behind an ice machine, raised a small revolver, and opened fire. Kennedy was struck 3 times at close range, including a fatal shot behind his right ear. 5 bystanders were wounded, but survived. And within seconds, a group of men, including former football player Rosie Greer and Olympic athlete Rafer Johnson, had tackled the gunman and pinned him to a steam table. His name was Sirhan Bishara Sirhan, and he was 24 years old. Sirhan had been born on March 19, 1944, in Jerusalem, then under British Mandate rule. He was a Palestinian Christian who held Jordanian citizenship, and his family had moved to the United States when he was a boy. He grew up in California, attended local schools, and worked odd jobs, including at a horse ranch, where he was reportedly thrown from a horse and suffered a head injury. What almost nobody around him knew was that he had been keeping notebooks filled with writings about Robert Kennedy, about the anniversary of the Six-Day War the year before, and about his growing anger over the senator's support for Israel. The weapon he used was an Iver Johnson .22 caliber revolver. In the chaos of the pantry, he continued pulling the trigger until the cylinder was empty. Bystanders would later describe a rapid sequence of gunshots, screams, and the sight of Kennedy on the floor with a hotel busboy named Juan Romero cradling his head. Kennedy was rushed to Good Samaritan Hospital, where surgeons worked for hours. He died the following day, on June 6, 1968, at the age of 42. The evidence recovered from Sirhan's room in Pasadena told a fuller picture in the days that followed. His notebooks contained repeated handwritten passages, some of them dated, that spoke of a decision to kill Robert Kennedy before June 5th. One entry, written the month before the shooting, expressed a fixation on the anniversary of the Six-Day War. Others rehearsed the wording of the act itself. For prosecutors, the notebooks would function as a written record of premeditation, filed away by the defendant's own hand. Defense attorneys would use the same notebooks as the foundation of an argument that Sirhan had been in a diminished mental state at the time of the killing, driven by ideology and by episodes he could not fully remember. He would later tell parole hearings over the decades that he had no clear memory of the shooting itself. Sirhan's trial began in Los Angeles under Judge Herbert Fife Walker, with defense attorney Grant Cooper leading his team. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and much of the defense focused on his mental state and on the notebooks investigators had found in his home. On April 17, 1969, he was convicted of first-degree murder. On April 23, 1969, he was sentenced to death. He was one of the men on California's death row when, in 1972, the California Supreme Court struck down the state's death penalty as unconstitutional. Sirhan's sentence, along with those of every other man on death row, was automatically commuted to life with the possibility of parole. What does the American parole process do with a man who has taken the life of a United States senator? For decades, the answer was that it kept saying no. Sirhan was denied parole again and again, hearing after hearing, in a process that stretched across more than half a century. For years he was housed at Corcoran, where his 10th parole hearing was held on prison grounds in June of 2003. He was later transferred to the Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in Otay Mesa, near San Diego, on November 22, 2013. Then, in 2021, something unexpected happened. At his 16th parole hearing, held on August 27th of that year, a two-member panel voted to grant him parole. Los Angeles County District Attorney George Gascon, under a new office policy, had declined to send a prosecutor to oppose it. Two of Robert Kennedy's sons publicly supported release. It appeared briefly that after 53 years in prison, Sirhan might walk free. On January 13, 2022, Governor Gavin Newsom reversed the grant, writing that Sirhan had not demonstrated adequate insight into his crime and that he remained a threat to public safety. Sirhan appeared before the board again on March 1, 2023, and was denied. He appeared again on August 16, 2024, at his 17th hearing, and was denied once more. In 2019, he had been seriously wounded in a stabbing attack by another inmate at Donovan and had to be treated at an outside hospital before returning to custody. As of today, Sirhan is 82 years old and remains incarcerated at the Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility. He is no longer housed at Corcoran, but his case is still moving through the California Parole Board process, almost 60 years after Robert Kennedy was killed. Sirhan's crime was public, political, and over in seconds. The man whose story comes next committed a crime that unfolded in almost the opposite way. Hidden, private, and stretched across nearly 2 decades in a quiet Northern California backyard that neighbors passed every day without ever knowing what was on the other side of the fence. Philip Craig Garrido. On the morning of August 26, 2009, a parole officer in Concord, California, was staring at a man across a conference table and trying to make sense of what he was hearing. The man was named Philip Garrido. He had come in that morning voluntarily, in the company of his wife and 2 young girls, after campus police at the University of California. Berkeley had grown concerned about his behavior during a visit to the campus the day before. The parole officer's questions had begun as routine, but the answers had not been routine at all. And by the end of that meeting, Garrido had told investigators something that would end an 18-year missing persons case, expose one of the most disturbing stories of long-term captivity in modern American history, and confirm that a girl who had disappeared in 1991 was still alive. Philip Garrido had been born on April 5, 1951, in Pittsburgh, California. He had struggled with drugs from the late 1960s, and in 1976 he had been convicted of a kidnapping and sexual assault involving an adult woman. He was sentenced to a 50-year federal term along with a separate state sentence. He served about 11 years before being paroled in 1988. When he was released back into the community, he was placed under lifetime federal parole supervision. 3 years later, on June 10, 1991, a girl was taken from a school bus stop near her home in South Lake Tahoe, California. Philip Garrido and his wife Nancy had used a stun gun to restrain her, forced her into their vehicle, and driven her back to their property in Antioch, California. Behind the house, hidden from view by fences, sheds, and overgrown vegetation, they had built a small compound of tents and outbuildings. She would be held there, cut off from the outside world, for the next 18 years. During her captivity, she gave birth to 2 daughters. For nearly 2 decades, no one on the outside knew she was there. Garrido remained on federal parole the entire time. Officers visited the property. Neighbors reported concerns. None of it broke through. The case only came apart when Garrido brought the 2 daughters onto the Berkeley campus in August of 2009 to try to distribute religious literature. Campus staff and officers noticed something they could not quite explain about the interaction and reported it to his parole officer. The interview that followed unraveled everything. The Berkeley officials who first grew concerned had not been looking for a missing person. They had noticed only that the way the 2 daughters interacted with the adults and the way they described themselves seemed inconsistent with their apparent circumstances. Their report was passed to campus police, who in turn contacted Garrido's federal parole officer in Concord. Within 24 hours of the initial concern, the Garridos and the 2 young women were sitting in a conference room in the parole office. What began as a routine follow-up became, as the officer's questions continued, an admission by Garrido that he had been holding a woman on his property. He identified her by the name he had given her during her captivity. It would only be after further questioning that investigators realized who she actually was, and that the name recorded in the 1991 missing persons file matched the woman he was describing. How could a case like this remain hidden for 18 years under active parole supervision? That question would drive investigations, reviews, and civil settlements for years to come. The state of California later acknowledged serious failures in the supervision of Garrido's case, and the survivor, J.C. Dugard, received a $20 million settlement from the state. Philip and Nancy Garrido were both charged in El Dorado County with multiple counts related to the taking of the child and the years that followed. Both eventually pleaded guilty in April of 2011, sparing the survivor and her daughters from testifying at trial. On June 2, 2011, Judge Douglas Phimister of El Dorado County Superior Court sentenced Philip Garrido to a term of 431 years to life in state prison. His wife Nancy was sentenced to 36 years to life. She is currently housed at the California Institution for Women and would not become parole eligible until roughly August of 2029. Philip Garrido was sent into the California prison system to serve a sentence he can never realistically complete. Given the risks he faced in general population, he was transferred to the Protective Housing Unit at the California State Prison at Corcoran, the same small unit that had already held Juan Corona and, for many years, Charles Manson. As of today, Philip Craig Garrido is 75 years old and remains housed in the Protective Housing Unit at Corcoran, still serving his 431 years to life. The survivor of his crimes went on to write publicly about her experience, establish a foundation supporting the recovery of those who have lived through abduction and trauma, and raise the 2 daughters born during her captivity. Her case reshaped how California monitors long-term parolees convicted of the most serious offenses, and the failures in Garrido's supervision were studied in detail by the state's Inspector General. Garrido's crime was hidden in plain sight for 18 years, on a suburban street where nothing looked out of the ordinary. Our fourth case begins in a very different setting, on the side of a busy Los Angeles freeway in the middle of the night, with a teenager whose criminal history at that point amounted to almost nothing at all. But a single moment behind a stalled convertible would put him behind the walls of Corcoran for the rest of his life, and would end the life of the only son of one of the most famous men in America. Mikhail Markasev. In the early morning hours of January 16, 1997, a 27-year-old man named Enes Cosby was driving alone down Interstate 405 in the Sepulveda Pass in Los Angeles when one of his tires went flat. He pulled off onto a dark shoulder near the Skirball Center Drive off-ramp and called a friend to come help him change it. While he waited outside his car, a young man walked up to him with a handgun, demanded money, and when the confrontation escalated, fired a single shot that struck Enes in the head. The friend Enes had called arrived a short time later and found him lying on the pavement beside his convertible. He died at the scene. Within hours, one of the largest homicide investigations Los Angeles had seen in years was underway, driven in part by the fact that the young man on the ground was the only son of comedian Bill Cosby. Enes William Cosby had been born in 1969, the second child of Bill and Camille Cosby. At the time of his death, he was studying to become a special education teacher at Columbia University's Teachers College. Friends and family members would later describe him as patient and drawn to work with children who struggled to learn to read, a difficulty he had faced himself. He had returned to Los Angeles that January to visit family. The flat tire on the 405 was a small, ordinary event on an ordinary drive home. The investigation moved slowly at first. Witnesses gave descriptions of a young man near the scene wearing a knit cap. A weapon and a cap were later recovered in the area, wrapped together, and it was that pairing that eventually led investigators to a suspect. A tabloid publication had offered a $100,000 reward for information, and in March of 1997, an acquaintance of the killer came forward to claim it. He named an 18-year-old immigrant from Ukraine named Mikhail Markasev, who had arrived in the United States in 1989. Markasev had a limited history of trouble, but nothing that pointed toward a killing on the side of a freeway. What sealed the case against him was a letter he wrote from jail, sent to a friend, in which he admitted that he had shot Enes Cosby during a botched robbery attempt. That letter, along with the recovered weapon and witness identification, formed the core of the prosecution's case. The letter Markasev wrote from jail was not the only piece of physical evidence that closed the case, but it was the piece that made a trial almost a formality. In it, he described the encounter on the 405 in his own words. He wrote that he had been out looking for someone to rob that night. He wrote that he had not known who Enes Cosby was when he approached the car. He wrote that when the confrontation escalated, he had fired the shot. The letter was addressed to a friend but was intercepted before it left the jail, and prosecutors would introduce it at trial as a signed, dated confession in the defendant's own handwriting. Combined with the recovered weapon and the tip that had led investigators to him in the first place, the letter left the defense with very little room to work in. What does the American legal system do with a teenager who takes the life of a stranger during a robbery gone wrong? On July 7, 1998, a Los Angeles jury convicted Markasev of first-degree murder, attempted robbery, and related charges. On August 11, 1998, he was sentenced to life in state prison without the possibility of parole, along with an additional 10-year enhancement. His attorneys immediately filed an appeal, arguing issues with the introduction of certain evidence and with the handling of the jailhouse letter. In February of 2001, while his appeal was still moving through the courts, Markasev did something that few defendants in his position ever do. He wrote a letter to the office of the California Deputy Attorney General, admitted to the killing, apologized to the Cosby family, and asked to have his appeals dropped. The letter was accepted, the appeals were dismissed, and Markasev formally gave up any legal path he had left to challenge his conviction. He was in his early 20s. He had voluntarily locked in a sentence of life without parole for the rest of his life. Markasev was sent into the California prison system and eventually housed at the California State Prison at Corcoran, where he has been documented in both the Protective Housing Unit and the Secure Housing Unit over the years. Reports from corrections officials and observers have generally described him as a quiet, cooperative inmate who has avoided serious disciplinary trouble inside the walls. He has been described as a model prisoner, a term that carries limited meaning in a system where he will never be released, but one that has followed him through his time in custody. The Cosby family responded to his sentence and to his later confession in ways that were, by design, quiet. Bill and Camille Cosby established the Ennis William Cosby Foundation, which for years supported programs focused on reading and learning disabilities in memory of the work Ennis had wanted to do as a teacher. His mother wrote publicly about the loss, and the family generally declined the kind of detailed media engagement that many high-profile victims' families are drawn into. The Cosbys directed public attention toward the educational work Ennis had wanted to do, and they kept the details of his death out of the coverage. As of today, Mikhail Markasev is in his mid-40s and remains incarcerated at the California State Prison at Corcoran, serving life in prison without the possibility of parole. He has now been in custody for more than half of his life, and under the terms of his sentence and his own voluntary abandonment of his appeals, he will remain inside the California prison system for the rest of it. On the shoulder of Interstate 405, a single shot fired during a botched robbery ended one life at 27 and reshaped another at 18. Markasev has remained inside the California prison system, most of that time at Corcoran in the years since. Markasev committed a single crime as a teenager and has spent the rest of his life inside the California prison system for it. The fifth story in this list runs almost in the reverse direction. It concerns a man who spent his entire adult life outside the system, hiding one of the longest and most violent criminal careers in modern American history, before he was finally identified as an old man living quietly on a suburban street. If you're enjoying this video and you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time. Subscribing genuinely helps this channel keep going. Joseph James DeAngelo. On the afternoon of April the 24th, 2018, a 72-year-old retired truck mechanic was arrested outside his home in Citrus Heights, California. For years, he had lived on that quiet suburban street with his adult daughters, and later, his grandchildren and neighbors had come to know him as a grouchy but ordinary older man who complained about garbage bins and puttered around in his yard. He had a wife who worked as an attorney. He had a modest ranch house. From the outside, he had the kind of life that suggested a quiet retirement. And when investigators finally identified him through a public genealogy database and a covertly obtained sample of his own DNA, they were closing out a case that had haunted California law enforcement for more than 4 decades and had gone by 3 different names: the East Area Rapist, the Original Night Stalker, and finally the Golden State Killer. Joseph James DeAngelo had been born on November 8, 1945, in Bath, New York. He had served in the United States Navy during the Vietnam War before returning to civilian life and pursuing a career in law enforcement. Through the 1970s, he worked as a police officer, first with the Exeter Police Department and then with the Auburn Police Department in Northern California. In 1979, he was fired from the Auburn force after he was caught shoplifting a can of dog repellent and a hammer from a local drugstore. It was, in every public sense, a minor and forgettable incident. It would remain that way for nearly 40 years, until investigators looking back through his life would notice that his firing lined up almost exactly with the middle of the most prolific and violent series of home invasion attacks in California history. Between 1974 and 1986, an unidentified man committed at least 13 murders and approximately 50 rapes across Northern and Southern California. He operated at night. He entered homes through windows and sliding doors while families slept, sometimes binding couples together, sometimes taking property, and sometimes returning to different neighborhoods weeks or months later. In the Sacramento region, where the earliest attacks occurred, investigators called him the East Area Rapist. As the crimes migrated south and turned deadly, investigators in Southern California, unaware they were dealing with the same offender, gave him a separate name: the original Night Stalker. It would take nearly 2 decades, and the emergence of DNA testing in the 1990s and 2000s, before those cases were formally linked, and the man responsible was renamed one more time as the Golden State Killer. The break in the case came in April of 2018. Investigators working with retired investigator Paul Holes uploaded a decades-old crime scene DNA profile to a public genealogy database used by amateur family historians. The upload produced no direct match, but it produced hits on distant relatives, and from those distant relatives, a family tree began to take shape. That tree eventually led investigators to Joseph James DeAngelo. Once he had been identified, investigators placed him under surveillance, waited for him to discard an item outside his car at a local hobby shop, and retrieved it for testing. The DNA on the discarded item matched the crime scene profiles from decades of unsolved attacks. He was arrested at his home on April the 24th, 2018. What does the American legal system do with a man who is finally identified nearly 4 decades after his last known killing, in a case where many of the underlying crimes are already past the statute of limitations for prosecution? For the district attorneys who inherited the case, the answer was to negotiate. To avoid the death penalty, DeAngelo agreed to plead guilty. On June 29, 2020, in a courtroom set up inside a Sacramento State University ballroom to allow social distancing during the pandemic, he pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder. As part of the same plea agreement, he formally admitted to dozens of additional rapes and burglaries that could no longer be separately charged under the statute of limitations. The sentencing hearing that followed the plea ran for 4 days across the same converted courtroom. Over those 4 days, dozens of survivors and family members addressed the man who had attacked them decades earlier from a lectern only a few feet from where he sat. Some had traveled from other states. Some had waited more than 40 years to speak. They described what had happened to them, what had happened to their spouses and to their parents, and what the years of not knowing had done to their lives in the interim. DeAngelo, seated in a wheelchair and wearing an orange jail uniform, remained silent through most of the hearing and offered only a brief whispered statement at the very end. On August 21, 2020, at the conclusion of the 4 days of statements, the judge imposed the sentence that had already been negotiated in the plea agreement: consecutive terms of life in prison without the possibility of parole. After sentencing, DeAngelo was processed through North Kern State Prison, and then, on January 26, 2021, transferred into the Protective Housing Unit at the California State Prison at Corcoran. He joined the small population of high-profile inmates who could not survive in general population. And among the men housed in the unit at the time of his arrival was Philip Garrido. Corrections officials have released almost no information about his daily life inside the unit. As of today, Joseph James D'Angelo is 80 years old and remains incarcerated in the protective housing unit at Corcoran, serving multiple consecutive terms of life without the possibility of parole. He will not be released. The investigative technique that identified him, now known formally as forensic genetic genealogy, has since been used to solve dozens of previously unsolvable cold cases across the United States. D'Angelo arrived at Corcoran's protective housing unit in 2021 and joined a group of inmates whose names had, for decades, shaped the American public's understanding of what kind of person ends up in a place like that. None of those names had shaped that understanding more completely than the man who had been housed in the same unit since 1989 and who had died there less than 4 years before D'Angelo walked through the door. Charles Manson. On the night of August 9, 1969, 4 young followers of a man named Charles Manson drove from a rundown ranch outside Los Angeles to a house in Benedict Canyon and took the lives of 5 people inside, including the actress Sharon Tate, who was in the late stages of pregnancy. The following night, at the direction of the same man, they killed 2 more, a couple named Leno and Rosemary LaBianca. Manson himself did not enter the first home. He did not fire a weapon. He did not hold a knife. And yet, by the time the murders were traced back to his group of followers, and one of them, a young woman named Susan Atkins, had begun to talk from inside a county jail, prosecutors were building a case that turned on a single legal reality. The killings had been ordered, and the man who had given the orders would spend the rest of his life inside the California prison system. Charles Manson had been born on November 12, 1934 in Cincinnati, Ohio, to a teenage mother. He was passed between relatives, foster homes, reform schools, and juvenile detention facilities throughout his youth, and by the time he reached adulthood, he had already accumulated convictions for car theft, forgery, and pimping. He spent most of his teens and 20s either incarcerated or on parole. When he was released from federal prison in 1967, he made his way to California, where he began assembling a communal group of mostly young followers, drifters, and runaways who were drawn to his mix of music, drugs, and improvised religious teachings. By 1969, that group had settled at Spahn Ranch, a rundown former Western movie set on the outskirts of Los Angeles. Manson had begun preaching an apocalyptic ideology he called Helter Skelter, borrowed loosely from a Beatles song, and reshaped into a prediction that a race war would soon consume American society. He believed his group would survive the war and emerge to rule the country afterward. And in the summer of 1969, he decided that his followers would help start the war themselves. On the night of August 9th, 4 members of his group, Charles Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian, drove to a rented home at 10,050 Cielo Drive in Benedict Canyon. Inside were the actress Sharon Tate and 4 other people who had been visiting her. All 5 were killed. On the following night, Manson himself accompanied the group to the home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca in Los Feliz, tied the couple up, and then left before Watson, Krenwinkel, and another follower killed them. Manson had entered the LaBianca home, but again left before the killings were carried out. The break in the case came in October of 1969, when Manson and members of his group were arrested during a raid at a Death Valley ranch on unrelated charges involving auto theft. In December of that year, prosecutors formally charged Manson and several of his followers with the Tate and LaBianca murders, after Susan Atkins, while in county custody, made incriminating statements to another inmate that eventually made their way to investigators. What does a court do with a man who ordered killings but did not commit them? For the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, the answer was to prosecute him under the theory of conspiracy and joint criminal responsibility. Manson was tried alongside 3 of his female followers in a proceeding that ran across most of 1970 and into early 1971, and that became one of the most closely watched criminal trials in American history. In January of 1971, he and his co-defendants were convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. In April of 1971, he was sentenced to death. When the California Supreme Court struck down the state's death penalty as unconstitutional in 1972, his sentence, along with those of every other man on California's death row, was automatically commuted to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole. During the trial itself, Manson and his female co-defendants disrupted the proceedings almost daily. At one point, Manson stood up, walked toward the bench with a sharpened pencil in his hand, and had to be physically restrained by bailiffs before he reached the judge. On another occasion, he carved an X into his forehead, a mark his co-defendants copied within days by carving the same X into their own. The lead prosecutor, Deputy District Attorney Vincent Bugliosi, built the case around the theory that Manson had used his psychological hold over his followers to direct the killings without ever handling a weapon himself. Bugliosi's later book about the case, published in 1974 under the title Helter Skelter, became one of the best-selling true crime works ever written and shaped how the case would be remembered for decades to come. Manson would appear before the California Parole Board repeatedly over the next 4 decades, and he would be denied every single time. He continued to attract public and media attention throughout his imprisonment, giving occasional interviews from inside prison walls. His final parole hearing was held in 2012. He was denied. By that point, Manson had been housed for more than 2 decades in the protective housing unit at the California State Prison at Corcoran, where he had been transferred in 1989. On November 19, 2017, he was pronounced dead at a hospital in Bakersfield, California, of cardiac arrest linked to complications of colon cancer. He was 83 years old. He had been in the custody of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation for 46 years. As of today, the Manson family murders remain among the most studied criminal cases in American legal and cultural history, and Corcoran's protective housing unit is still the location most Americans associate with the last decades of his life. Manson spent almost half a century inside California's prisons for the murders his followers committed at his direction. The 7th name on this list also spent time at Corcoran, but only for a very brief window, and for reasons that had almost nothing to do with the notoriety of the men housed in the units around him. Danny Masterson. On the morning of September 7, 2023, a former network television star walked into a Los Angeles courtroom to be sentenced for 2 rapes committed at his Hollywood Hills home more than 2 decades earlier. He had spent much of his adult life as a familiar face on American sitcoms and had been for years one of the more prominent members of the Church of Scientology in the entertainment industry. It had taken 2 full trials, a hung jury in the first, and a second jury that deliberated across several days, to reach the moment when Judge Charlene Olmedo would look down from the bench and impose a state prison sentence of 30 years to life. The actor's name was Danny Masterson. He was 47 years old, and by the end of the following January, he would be housed inside the walls of the California State Prison at Corcoran. Danny Masterson had been born on March 13, 1976, and had come up through a family with deep ties to Scientology and to the entertainment industry. He rose to national attention through his role on the long-running sitcom That 70s Show, which aired for 8 seasons beginning in the late 1990s, and he continued to work in television and film for years afterward. Throughout his adult life, he was publicly identified with the Church of Scientology and was frequently described in press coverage as one of its most visible celebrity members. The criminal case against him began in 2017 when the Los Angeles Police Department confirmed that it was investigating him in connection with sexual assault allegations from multiple women. In June of 2020, he was formally charged with 3 counts of forcible rape, all involving assaults on women at his home between 2001 and 2003. Prosecutors alleged that in each case, the victim had been given a drink and then assaulted while incapacitated. Masterson denied the allegations and pleaded not guilty. His first trial began in the fall of 2022 and ended in a mistrial in November of that year, after jurors were unable to reach a unanimous verdict on any of the 3 counts. Prosecutors decided to retry the case. The second trial began the following spring, and on May 31, 2023, the jury returned a verdict. Masterson was convicted on 2 of the 3 counts of forcible rape. The jury was unable to reach a unanimous verdict on the 3rd count, on which they reportedly leaned toward conviction but did not have the votes. Prosecutors had built the case at both trials around testimony from 3 women who had known Masterson socially during the years when the assaults were alleged to have occurred, each of whom described a pattern the prosecution argued was consistent across the incidents. Testimony extended over multiple days at the retrial and was closely followed by both the entertainment and the legal press. Defense attorneys argued at length that the interactions had been consensual and that certain aspects of the women's accounts had shifted over the years since. The trial judge, before deliberations began, gave the jury detailed instructions on how to weigh testimony from multiple witnesses whose accounts corroborated one another under California law. At the retrial, the jury deliberated across parts of 7 days before returning the split verdict that convicted Masterson on 2 counts and hung on the 3rd. How does the California prison system handle a public figure convicted of 2 decade-old sexual assaults, with a set of religious affiliations that made his imprisonment complicated from the day his conviction was announced? The first answer was to move him carefully. On September 7, 2023, Judge Charlene Olmedo of the Los Angeles County Superior Court sentenced him to 30 years to life in state prison, with the 2 rape convictions running consecutively. He was ordered into the custody of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, processed through the reception center at North Kern State Prison, and then, on January 29, 2024, transferred to the California State Prison at Corcoran, where he was housed at a Level 4 security classification. His stay at Corcoran did not last long. On February 16, 2024, roughly 2.5 weeks after his arrival, corrections officials transferred him to the California Men's Colony, a medium and minimum security facility in San Luis Obispo. Reporting at the time attributed the transfer to concerns about his safety inside a maximum security environment, given the nature of his convictions and the profile of the men housed in the yard around him. His attorneys have continued to challenge his convictions in the years since. In 2024 and 2025, his defense filed a series of appeals and habeas petitions arguing, among other things, that his trial counsel had been ineffective, that the trial judge had shown bias, and that the prosecution had improperly focused on his affiliation with the Church of Scientology in a way that prejudiced the jury. Those appeals remain pending. Under the terms of his sentence, Masterson will not become parole eligible until roughly July of 2042, when he is 66 years old. His first board consultation, according to court filings, has been tentatively scheduled for May of 2038. As of today, Danny Masterson is 49 years old and remains incarcerated at the California Men's Colony, no longer at Corcoran, but housed within the California prison system, on a sentence he cannot begin to work off for another 16 years. Masterson passed through Corcoran quickly, and his name is attached to the prison only through a short administrative window in early 2024. The final case on this list belongs to a very different kind of inmate, not a household name, not a famous killer, and not the subject of a national trial. He is a low-profile offender whose entire pattern of violence has unfolded inside the walls of California's prisons themselves. And in September of 2024, he added one more entry to a record that was already long. Bobby Dominguez. On the afternoon of September 3, 2024, a correctional officer at the California State Prison at Corcoran was walking his post near a bank of shower cells when an inmate on the other side of the bars reached through the opening and struck him with a weapon. The weapon had not been smuggled in from outside. It had been built inside the prison itself, sharpened and shaped by hand from materials the inmate had access to in his cell block, turned into something capable of cutting flesh. The officer was taken to an outside medical facility, treated for his injuries, and released the same evening. And the man who had attacked him, a 30-year-old inmate named Bobby Dominguez, would within days be transferred out of Corcoran, referred for prosecution on charges of attempted homicide, and formally added by California's Corrections Department to a record of in-custody violence that already stretched back a decade. Bobby Dominguez is not a name most Americans have ever heard. He is not the subject of a documentary, and he is not a defendant in a nationally covered trial. His inclusion on this list is not a reflection of the size of the crimes that first put him inside a prison, but rather of what he has done from inside it. He arrived at Corcoran and at every facility before it as a low-level offender, and what has kept him inside the California prison system is the fact that he has never stopped committing violent acts while he has been in it. His record with the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation begins on April 11, 2014, when he was first received from Los Angeles County to serve a 4-year sentence for inflicting corporal injury on a cohabitant, a domestic violence charge. He was not yet 25 years old. He would not walk out of the California prison system as a free man again. On June 23, 2016, he was sentenced to an additional 5 years for an in-prison assault with a deadly weapon. On June 21, 2017, he was sentenced to another year for a battery on a person who was not another prisoner. Each of those new sentences extended the total time he owed the state, and each of them was for a violent act committed after he had already been placed in custody. The pattern in his file is not just a list of dates. Each of the sentences he accumulated between 2014 and 2017 was for violence committed against another person, and most of those acts happened inside a facility where he was already being held. Corrections officers, other inmates, and civilians who came onto prison grounds all appear at different points in the record as people he assaulted or attempted to assault. That kind of accumulation is not unusual in the abstract. It reflects the shape of a career in the California prison system that many inmates never fully escape, moving between facilities and between security levels as each new incident is added to their file. What made Dominguez's case notable enough for a formal CDCR news release was the specific choice he made on September 3, 2024, and the fact that the officer he attacked survived in part because of the way the shower door had been constructed. In 2023, after a period back in county custody, he was received into state prison again. On June 20th of that year, he was sentenced by Monterey County to 6 years for an assault with a deadly weapon on a peace officer. Because of his prior violent conviction record, The case was prosecuted under California's second strike sentencing enhancement, which nearly doubled his exposure. That was the sentence he was serving on September 3, 2024, when he reached through the bars of the shower door at Corcoran and attacked the correctional officer standing on the other side. What happens to a man whose criminal record grows almost entirely inside the walls of the institutions built to contain him? For California, the answer has been to keep moving him. After the September attack, Dominguez was transferred out of Corcoran and into the California Healthcare Facility in Stockton, a specialized institution that houses inmates with acute medical or mental health needs. Though corrections officials have not publicly disclosed a diagnosis in his case, the Kings County District Attorney's Office has been given jurisdiction over the attempted homicide investigation, and the results of that referral are still pending. In the news release announcing the attack, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation described Dominguez as an incarcerated person with what it called an extensive history of crime while incarcerated. The phrase was not casual. It was a summary of a case file that includes multiple assaults on staff, multiple in-prison sentencing enhancements, and multiple facility transfers, all of them accumulated during years he was already in state custody. As of today, Bobby Dominguez is 31 years old and remains in the custody of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, currently housed at the California Healthcare Facility while the Kings County investigation continues. He has now spent more than a decade of his adult life in state prison. He is not eligible for release in the near term, and each new incident inside the walls has, historically, added years to the time he owes. His name is not on any list of famous California killers, but his name is on the list of people whose violence has become part of the daily working reality of the officers who staff California's most closely watched maximum security prison, and it is on the record that Corcoran itself continues to generate every year that it stays open. 8 men, 1 prison, and a criminal history that has moved through its walls for more than 4 decades. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.